Welcome to the Last Pillar YouTube channel. Please subscribe, like, and share to support us. Today, it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. David A. Hughes to the show. David is a scholar with degrees from Oxford and Duke. He is the author of two important books, COVID-19, Psychological Operation and the War for Technocracy, and Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State. David left his university career to speak the truth, and he relies 100% on public support to continue his work. I encourage everyone to support him however you can. We are grateful to have him here and help us see the big picture. So welcome and thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very grateful to be here.
Thank you. I will just show the covers of your book for a second. This is the COVID-19 book, and of course, Wall Street and the Nazis. And 1 second. Yeah. So, Dr. Hughes, your research connects the past to the present in a very striking way. You argue that the current global crisis is actually an undeclared global class war, one that has been prepared for since the 40s or even before by a transnational deep state, with history of a series of counter-revolutions. You show that the financial fraternity of Wall Street banks and wealthy families actually funded the rise of the Nazis, not just for profit, but for deeper ideological reasons. To start off, can you explain how these hidden power structures works with examples like the Nazis or the Cold War, and how the same interests that backed the Nazis in the past are driving the technocratic coup today?
Wow, it's a big opening question. So the power structure that you're referring to is what I call the transnational deep state. And in my book, Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State, I traced the origins of that power structure back to the 1940s, centered primarily on the United States. You could look, for example, at the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, which later became the CIA, and the overall national security apparatus that emerged from 1947 on. In my book, I discuss the pivotal role of George Kennan in all of this. But at that time, a new architecture of governance internationally was being formed. For example, NATO in 1949, of course. And what I argue is that these new agencies, which were coming into existence in the late 1940s, centered primarily on the United States, were not merely US in orientation. They were from the very beginning transnational. Of course, it wasn't long after that we had the Five Eyes structure come into being. And what's important to understand about this is that there is a clandestine dimension to these organizations. They typically, particularly the CIA, for example, operates in great secrecy. And as time has gone on, we've been able to see some of these clandestine structures emerge. So I mentioned NATO. Now, NATO, during the Cold War, in the 1970s and 1980s, was running what was called Operation Gladio. At least that was the Italian branch of it. It was actually Europe-wide and also in Turkey. And this was a series of false flag terrorism events in which innocent civilians were deliberately killed as part of what was known as the strategy of tension. And the idea was to keep the population fearful and afraid that it could be attacked at any moment, and therefore willing to cede more power to the security state. It was also a very effective means of tarnishing leftists, because leftists were assigned the blame for these events, when in actual fact it wasn't them at all. Now we know about this because of revelations that emerged in the 1990s in Italy. But it's pretty shocking, isn't it, to think that NATO actually was at the heart of this. And then when you think about that modus operandi, the strategy of tension, well, that's exactly what was at the heart of the so-called global war on terror after 9/11. Same kind of logic. Terrorists could strike at any moment. Therefore, the public is expected to cede certain civil liberties in the name of security. Increasingly draconian legislation was passed, and then that all led up to the COVID event. And there were revelations, for example, from the Netherlands in late 2024 from the Dutch health minister there, that Dutch health policy during COVID had essentially been determined by, guess who? NATO. And so what I argue across my work is that COVID was actually a military operation rather than a genuine public health crisis. And so the point about all of this is that we've entered an era now where ideas about national sovereignty and liberal democracy need to be seriously called into question, particularly with the COVID operation, where virtually all countries responded in more or less identical fashion, was a clear indicator of a broader transnational power structure, which, as I say, has been developing since at least the 1940s. You could probably trace it back earlier in different forms. And governments now are not enacting the will of the people as per classical liberal theory in any shape or form. They are enacting policy which is formulated at higher levels by organisations like Chatham House or the CFR or whoever, and governments are mere implementers of these policies. And as we saw during the COVID operation, the arguments I make in my work is that this was psychological warfare on a scale never seen before. And so essentially that implies governments all across the world attacking their own citizens with highly advanced psychological techniques. So the social contract is completely broken in that respect. And all of this means that we are now living in a very precarious period of history. I refer to it as an interregnum. I think the previous power structures rooted in liberal democracy, fiat currency, neoliberal economics, classical mass propaganda, and so on, that paradigm has increasingly been breaking down in recent years. And what the transnational ruling class is seeking to do through its transnational deep state is to refashion the whole of society globally in a new image. And the new image is totalitarian. It's a system known as technocracy, which is antithetical to liberal democracy. It's the scientific management of society, and it implies ultimate control if this comes in. So these are pretty massive questions. They require a very kind of long-term historical lens to be able to get a grip on what's really happening. And all of that answer, I still didn't touch on the Nazis, but I'm sure we'll get to them.
Yeah, so actually I would like to use the example of the Nazis and who supported and funded them and for what end, and what kind of patterns can we recognize from the past to the present, especially if you can give examples of specific companies, part of the Wall Street gang that actually supported the Nazis, and how does it connect to eugenics of that time and today?
Yes, it's quite shocking, particularly for those in the United States, to discover this history. In Chapter 3 of Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State, I list some very well-known US companies like DuPont, like Ford, like Standard Oil, like the Chase Bank, owned by very powerful families, such as the Rockefellers. And this raft of corporations was essentially in league with the Nazis, was responsible for funding the rise of Hitler, was responsible for funding the development of the Nazi war machine, for example, through synthetic rubber and gasoline and so on the part of Standard Oil. And was responsible for the continuation of the war once it got started. And these companies demonstrated no patriotic loyalty. For example, Standard Oil was shipping oil to Nazi Germany in boats with Panamanian colours, so as not to be detected, while refusing to supply the same materials to the United States. Similarly, Ford was quite happy to manufacture vehicles for both sides in the name of making money. And Henry Ford himself was a notorious Hitler supporter and anti-Semite. There was also in the United States in 1933 something called the Business Plot, which was an attempted fascist coup instigated by these very same Wall Street connected actors. That was only foiled because its intended leader, General Smedley Butler, refused to participate. And so the relevance of all of this is that the desire of the ruling class to destroy liberal democracy is almost a century old now. You can certainly trace it back to the early 1930s, the post-Wall Street crash era, the Great Depression, and so on. At that time, there was genuine risk of revolution because the capitalist system was in crisis. And totalitarianism, from a ruling class perspective, is a wonderful solution. It's brutal, but it's an effective way of keeping the working classes in check. And so we saw the rise of the Nazis, Stalinist, Soviet Union, etc., fascism in Japan and Italy. It begs the question, doesn't it? If that business plot in 1933 had been successful in the United States, would the entire world then have turned fascist and ultimately totalitarian? I think that's conceivable. Instead, what we've seen is a century or so of so-called liberal democracy. It's really a system of managed consent through propaganda and other means, as Herman and Chomsky and many others have written about. Indeed, Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann in the 1920s were writing about precisely this. But today, we are now seeing a deliberate attempt worldwide to effect the controlled demolition of liberal democracy so that the new totalitarian system, technocracy, can be brought in. You mentioned eugenics, and of course, Nazi Germany is famous for its eugenics. But we also know that eugenics is a preferred mode of thinking, shall we say, for the ruling classes. If you think about it, it's a direct form of control over populations and over human bodies. And again, when we're looking at the present and everything which took place during COVID in terms of gaining access to bodies, when we think about transhumanism and so on, that's just a 21st century form of eugenics, in my opinion. And some of the very same actors that have been at the heart of these projects recently, like Bill Gates, for example, and the Rockefellers, they can be traced all the way back to eugenics organizations in the United States 100 years ago. And the Rockefeller Foundation was funding the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, which became notorious for eugenics experiments even before the medical experiments in the concentration camps. So it's actually very frightening what we're dealing with. And towards the end of Wall Street, the Nazis and the crimes of the deep state, I get into where this could all lead because the historical parallels and trajectories are similar for reasons that are non-accidental. And if this global technocratic coup, as I refer to it, is allowed to continue, I fear that we may see the return of some of the worst elements of 20th century history just repackaged in new forms in the 21st century. So this is why I'm trying to sound the alarm as loud as I can in my work and to convey these ideas to as many people as possible.
Absolutely. How do they use, for example, emergency laws, even during the time of the burning of the Reichstag and today, to basically take away our freedoms, basically voluntarily, because we are under stress and pressure? So, if you can give us a few examples from the past to be able to recognize this method and how they apply it today.
Well, I mean, the burning of the Reichstag is the obvious one. Historians dispute whether or not this was deliberate or accidental. It looks pretty deliberate to me
Mhm.
from what I've read. And as so often with false flag events, one way of recognizing them is to look at their consequences. And in Nazi Germany, this event was immediately blamed on communists, and Nazi thugs went around the country arresting communists and beating them, and so on. So an effective way of attacking political opposition whilst also intimidating the native population. And then you mentioned emergency laws. Well, of course, the Reichstag decree initiated the sequence of events and legislation, which in a short period of time led to Hitler becoming the Fuhrer with total control over Nazi Germany. So it's interesting to think about that mode of operation, and then to fast forward to more recent times and think about 9/11, for example. So again, we're seeing a spectacular attack on a major building, which again was, or series of buildings, I should say, which again was linked to, in this case, Islamists, alleged Islamists.
Mhm.
So again, an enemy was immediately defined. Osama bin Laden's name was mentioned on Fox News just 45 seconds after the second tower was struck. So it was planted right there in the public consciousness.
Mhm.
And this spectacular event, again, was used to get away with things which otherwise would have been inconceivable. Not just the raft of imperialist interventions in the Middle East and North Africa region, and indeed beyond, all of the drone assassinations as well, which followed particularly under Obama, in which people have no opportunity to protest their innocence or receive a fair trial or anything like that. Torture in Guantanamo Bay, and then all of the oppressive measures at home, beginning with the TSA in the United States and the measures at airports, increasing levels of surveillance in society, which has only got worse and worse and worse as the 21st century has continued. And what the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben referred to as a permanent state of emergency. So it's not just the case that you have a single event which leads to a single suspension of the constitution and suspension of the rule of law and ordinary democratic practices. The logic of the war on terror is such that essentially this is just permanent. At any time, the executive branch can declare what it perceives to be the right to act however it likes. And when you read the policy documents emanating out of the United States in the early period of the war on terror, it's essentially claiming the right to act anywhere in the world whenever it wants for whatever reason. So this is it's just an attack on the rule of law. And then we get to COVID, and what do we see? Very similar modus operandi. We have another major event used to drive fear into the population. And what do we see in country after country? Very draconian legislation being rolled out under the pretext of emergency measures being necessary. In this country, the UK, we had the UK Coronavirus Act, which was 600 pages long or something. This was pretty much all ready to go by March late March, the 23rd of March, I think, 2020. How is that the case? How is that readied so fast? And it's very reminiscent of 9/11 and the USA Patriot Act, which I think was passed a month after 9/11. Very short period of time, again, to put together this very long document, which was just rammed straight through Congress, much as the UK Coronavirus Act was just rammed straight through Parliament under these political climate of fear and intimidation. What politician is actually going to stand up against this and say, hold on a minute, we need to slow down? A former QC in this country, Lord Jonathan Sumption, was actually very critical of this at the time. He immediately spotted the strongly authoritarian nature of the Coronavirus Act. And so we live in what Kees van der Pijl, former emeritus professor, calls the millennium of fear. Really, the whole mode of governance in the 21st century has had less to do with liberal democracy in any meaningful sense than this rolling series of manufactured crises used to create governance through emergency. And it doesn't just have to be terrorism and disease. You can think about financial crisis. You can think about the routine threats regarding Russia allegedly wanting to use nuclear weapons and North Korea wanting to use nuclear weapons and all of this kind of thing. The nuclear aspect, of course, goes way back into the Cold War, all used for a strategy of tension, keeping populations constantly on edge, constantly afraid, constantly in a state of stress, which is very important. I get into that in chapter 2 of my COVID book. If you can keep populations in a state of constant stress, then they become more psychologically susceptible, and it becomes easier to program them through propaganda and other psychological techniques. So unfortunately, this is just one example, this kind of emergency powers, emergency acts after major events. This is just one example of dozens and dozens of continuities with the Nazi era and what we've seen in the political economy of the West since 2020. And again, I get into all of those in Wall Street, the Nazis and the crimes of the deep state, particularly chapter 2, across multiple spheres of life. My overall argument is that what we've seen since 2020 across the West in many ways resembles what happened in 1930s Nazi Germany. Now, of course, the worst horrors of Nazi Germany came later, particularly from 1941 onwards, with the War of Annihilation in the East and the Holocaust and other awful events. Mm-hmm. But the point is, it took years to build that totalitarian state and for those things, those horrors, to become possible. And what I am seeing now in the era that we are now living in is a similar preparing of the groundwork for worse things to come. Just one small example has to do with euthanasia. One of the lessons that historians have drawn from Nazi Germany is that genocide, it didn't just come out of nowhere. You can actually trace it back to much earlier in the regime, to euthanasia programs framed as deaths of mercy. It's supposed to be a good thing, putting suffering people out of their misery and so on. But it morphed and it escalated. And then it became the pretext for killing disabled children through the Action T4 program. And then it grew further and developed into killing of entire racial groups and so on. So it's very troubling then that we now live in an era where, particularly since 2020, euthanasia is making a comeback. Most obviously with the so-called MAID program in Canada, which has grown enormously, but also in the UK, particularly driven by the COVID Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. The Assisted Dying Act is now here in the UK. And just like with Nazi Germany, it's all framed in terms of mercy and, helping suffering people and so on. But the point is, in the broader context where we know that the aim is a global totalitarian state. We can see that this is all part of a larger picture, and it really is a major source of alarm. And as I say, when you get into the many other parallels and continuities between the present and 1930s Nazi Germany, the public needs to understand this and to take action to stop what's going on.
Yes. Can you explain the term, which I will probably not be able to pronounce, Gleichschaltung, which is coordination? Can you give examples of how they actually coordinate everything and how it comes to be in medicine, in law, in media, without using an army? And how does it play to what you describe as World War III, basically, which is an omniwar and completely different from the old way? Uh, it's important for me if you can demonstrate it so people can recognize the patterns again.
Yeah, so this was a term that was strongly associated with Nazi Germany. There is no direct English equivalent. Coordination is a reasonable translation. Switching into the same gear is kind of more literal. And people often think of this in terms of, I don't know, the mass rallies or whatever, or thousands of people all giving the Hitler salute, or the kind of the mass torchlit rallies and so on. And that's one example, but it's kind of cliched because the truth of Nazi Germany was more nuanced than that. But what it fundamentally entails is not going against the regime. So essentially, in many ways, citizens in Nazi Germany did enjoy a certain degree of freedom within their own lives to make their own choices, provided that they did not go against the regime. And at that level, everyone had to be switched into the same gear, so to speak. And we saw it across all of society. We saw it with the Nazification of the law, for instance, and judges essentially abandoning the rule of law in a meaningful sense and making rulings which were always in keeping with the regime. We saw it in academia, where the genuine pursuit of the truth was abandoned, and academics prostituted themselves before the regime and started participating in Nazi pseudoscience and so on. And so this follows all the way through. And again, the idea is that you're simply not allowed to question the power structure. A lot of freedom, in some senses, provided you don't fundamentally challenge the power structure, but you mustn't do that. And again, we've been seeing similar things in more recent times to do with so-called official narratives, and you're not allowed to question them. You mustn't question climate change. You mustn't question the reality of the war on terror. You mustn't question the idea that there was a deadly pandemic in 2020 and only these exceptional measures were responsible for saving millions and millions of lives. If you do, you find that you have all kinds of problems. Those who are able to actually think critically and question these kinds of narratives often find that their careers in the professions are cut short, or that they are ostracized professionally and within society. They are labeled with the propaganda term conspiracy theory, which is a crude but enormously effective means of stigmatizing people. Surprisingly, many people seem afraid to be branded with that term. Life gets much harder. And as we saw during COVID, those who went against the official COVID narrative were persecuted. Doctors lost their licenses to practice. The so-called pandemic of the unvaccinated, a dreadful propaganda term, not at all rooted in science, was used to stigmatize and demonize dissenters. There was one crazy period in the autumn of 2021 where those who were refusing to take the shots were ostracized to such a degree that in certain places they weren't allowed to, eat in the same restaurants as
Yes.
other people. There was a kind of a two-tier society created in many different countries. Literally different lanes at airports, for example, for vaccinated and unvaccinated people. It was a form of apartheid. And again, it doesn't take a wild leap to go back to Nazi Germany and the treatment of the Jews. The idea that they are spreaders of disease, pandemic of the unvaccinated, same kind of idea, spreaders of disease. All lies, of course, but this is how it works, and this is what we're up against. So any totalitarian control system does rely on this Gleichschaltung, that people are fundamentally on the same page about the key issues. And the problem that the control system has at the moment is that more and more people are openly criticizing and calling out these narratives. More and more evidence is emerging into the public domain of the extent to which we have been lied to about these fundamental narratives, which are providing the pretext for reshaping the whole of society. And this is why the levels of censorship have been increasing and increasing since 2020, because there's a real danger now that the truth will come flooding out. And so first it was YouTube and Facebook banning and shadow banning, algorithmically manipulating dissident content creators. Many ended up on Substack, which promised to be a free speech platform, and predictably enough, it's turned out to be the opposite. It's bent the knee to the UK and Australian Online Safety Acts, and so is now itself a censorship platform.
I understand that you cannot get messages on Substack anymore, right?
Yes, I mean, I'm in the process of ultimately leaving Substack. I don't have any paid subscribers anymore on Substack because I severed the connection between Stripe and Substack. So Substack will get no more money from my supporters. In case people don't realize, 10% of your subscription fee on Substack goes straight to Substack and not to the content creator. So I'm not willing to support these censorship measures which are coming in. So I've had a pretty tough month just gone. Didn't really get a break over the Christmas period at all because I've been building my own website. I'm in the process of migrating my paid subscribers whose Stripe accounts are still active, but I'm in the process of migrating them from Substack to Stripe. I've been successful in about a quarter of cases in my subscriber base so far, but it's a lot of hard work. For each subscriber, there's a process that you need to go through, which takes about 20 different steps, and you have to be very careful to get it right. My remaining paid subscribers, I've currently given a complimentary subscription to on the new website, so they are recognized as paid members and receive the relevant benefits. But this has proven to be a huge amount of work. It's meaning that I have far less time to be doing research and so on. But it's important. But it just shows the nature of the information war that we're in, because it's hard enough doing the research in the first place. It's hard enough reaching people in the first place. And then you end up on a platform like Substack, which seemed to be pretty good for the 18 months or so when I was using it. And then all of a sudden, it goes the same way as everywhere else. And so really, the people who are most committed to telling the truth about what's happening are being hunted all over the internet, put into these kettled into online silos on social media. Social media very much a social containment mechanism. Many people very actively shouting into the void there or preaching to the choir, and not necessarily reaching the people that need to be reached. And again, what was Nazi Germany notorious for? Censorship, of course, book burning. We see lots of content just going missing. on the internet now, dead internet theory. It's really enormously problematic, and the media, of course, in Nazi Germany, as part of the Gleichschaltung, all had to toe the official line. They were all given their scripts from Goebbels, who actually complained that they weren't making it look different enough, because it was all looking too obviously like state propaganda. Not very convincing when it's like that. But what have we got today? All the mainstream news comes from the same three organizations, Reuters and AP and so on. And again, you look at what comes out, and it's all so similar, and there's a reason for that. You have so-called journalists just rewriting scripts that they've been handed. So this is why independent journalism has been so important over the last 20 years or so, but now it's being throttled, and states are even resorting to lawfare against certain individuals who are challenging the narrative too strongly, or bringing hard evidence to bear, which contradicts these official narratives. So yeah, that's perhaps a slightly long-winded answer, but again, just a one-word concept like Gleichschaltung goes into so many different areas, and it's important for people to kind of grasp how big this thing is.
Yeah, I would like to take advantage of your expertise and go back again to the Nazis for a second, and to speak about the Nazi expertise in mind control and social control, who simply moved into Western intelligence agencies. So it's not only the scientists. We are talking here about like the establishment of maybe even the CIA, before it was the OSS, right? And in 1947, it turned into the CIA. And from what I understand, this organization and the Gehlen organization in East Europe, and all the rest of it, is all just Nazis who are pushing the same ideology and using their expertise to facilitate the new intelligence organization in the West. So maybe you can explain about that.
Yeah, I have multiple examples again in Wall Street, the Nazis and the crimes of the deep state. What happened after 1945? The official history, of course, is that the Nazis lost, they were evil, and that the good West won. Very simple black and white stuff for the masses. The historical reality is a good deal more complicated. Denazification in West Germany was an abject failure. Many of those who were found guilty at Nuremberg were reinstated to top positions of power within a matter of months or a few years, including some of the leading industrialists, many of whom had been linked with the Nazi regime and were instigating slave labor during the Nazi years. Well, they were all kind of back in top positions before not too long. Internationally as well, there were some, particularly in NATO, I should add, many former Nazis were finding their ways into positions of influence. And then you mention Operation Paperclip, for example, and also the Gehlen organization, which were deliberately used to recruit former Nazis to come and work for the United States in particular. That's what I deal with mostly in my book. Again, the Soviet Union was also doing similar things, but my emphasis is more on the West, and particularly the CIA. And what's important to understand is that some of the very worst actors, really, some of those who had done some of the most heinous deeds during Nazi Germany, were brought across, and their experience was drawn upon. So you think about the MK Ultra program, for instance, and that in some ways drew on some of the medical experiments in the concentration camps. Former Nazis who had been involved in some of the, the mass killings in the war of extermination in the East. They were recruited. Why? Because as Nazis, they were rabidly anti-Soviet, and this was the Cold War era. So it was seen as advantageous to have these kind of characters on board. The scale and extent of it all is really quite shocking. Um, Not just Germans, incidentally, but if you think about certain, for instance, Ukrainian nationalists who had partnered with the Nazis during that awful campaign in the East. Some of those were also recruited by the West. And so, unfortunately, what you see are strong and multiple lines of continuity whereby not just Nazis, but some of the very worst Nazis were rehabilitated, given positions of power and influence. And in Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State, I have a chapter which deals with the darker aspects of US foreign policy from 1945 to the present. It's a chapter called Intelligence Crime. And many of the most heinous aspects of that foreign policy, again, have similarities with techniques which were practiced by the Nazis, not least torture, of course. Yeah, and so it would be a grave mistake to think that Nazi Germany simply went away in 1945. What I have come to suspect is not only were these individuals recruited, for example, those who were experimenting with sarin gas and so on in the camps, were recruited into the MK Ultra program. Not only were these individuals recruited, but I think that the ruling classes of the world would have been reflecting back on Nazi Germany almost as an experiment in totalitarian control and trying to determine what is possible and what is not, what worked and what didn't, because we've seen so many similarities with that period of history more recently. Again, it can't be accidental. It looks very choreographed and designed and deliberate to me, which is a really troubling proposition. The psychologist Philip Zimbardo, he specialized in, his research area was the psychology of evil, and he was eager to understand how it's possible to get ordinary human beings to commit atrocities and acts of evil. And Nazi Germany is a well-known case study in that regard. The point is that he intended his work as a means of preventing a repeat of the past, of stopping these kind of things from happening again. But unfortunately, I think that his work looks more like a blueprint, which has been misappropriated and abused by very powerful people who, again, are looking precisely at measures of manipulating the masses for evil purposes. And, what did we see during COVID? The most atrocious behavior, really, by those who thought that they were virtuous in their masks and treating others absolutely appallingly. Yeah, I'll stop at that.
Yeah, so basically we are dealing here with some kind of a dual state where the people who are actually in control are hidden from the scrutiny of the public. And if before we had foreign enemies and rival leaders who are fighting against each other, it seems like everything today is being utilized to control the people. And it's a war against the population itself of each country. Um, please help my audience to understand it very deeply, because it's like when we look at the world news today, we see as if there is rivalry between different Putin here, America there, China, and all the rest of it. And I think they are all actors in a bigger charade. So if you had now, for example, control over the media, and you were able to destroy the narrative, what kind of a new view would you be able to demonstrate to the public to open their eyes to the truth of this beastly nature?
Coming back to Nazi Germany, in Milton Mayer's book, They Thought They Were Free, he interviews a philologist who lived through Nazi Germany. And the philologist reflects that the media was used day and night to keep the population distracted. It was always about what official enemies were up to, so that the population was kind of looking anywhere but at the rot that was manifesting itself at home. And he used the analogy of wheat growing in a field. And he says you're walking around in this field, and then one day, before you notice it, it's suddenly above your head, and it's too late, and you're lost, because the kind of the cancer, as it were, has been spreading while the population has been distracted with endless other things. I think that's what's going on again today. If anyone is naive enough to listen to the mainstream media and actually accept what it's saying, all you get is this endless stream of crises and alleged threats from other parts of the world, alleged threats from terrorism and many other sources. Russia, of course, tends to be the big one here in the UK and elsewhere in the West. Russia's always on the brink of doing something terrible. It goes back to the Cold War, doesn't it? This sense that, Russia, might invade and overwhelm the whole of Western Europe. It was never in a position to do that. This was just propaganda. So this is all being used to make sure that the public is looking anywhere but the true threat. And the true threat is a transnational ruling class which has gone to war against the people of all countries. It's what I call an omniwar, with a view to instituting a totalitarian control system. And all the time, these new measures, which are pushing towards technocracy, are being consistently introduced in country after country. It doesn't matter what government is in charge. It makes no difference. Left-right distinctions don't really apply here. It's more of a vertical kind of up-down class war that is taking place. In 2025, we've seen a lot going on in terms of Palantir, for example, and Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and others, very close to the heart of the US government, particularly in the early stages of 2025. The increasing digitization of government. The Ukrainian digital state was announced about a year ago and is being held up as the model for all other states to emulate. Most countries have something called a Ministry of Digital Transformation, or words to that effect. Again, it's pretty frightening, because once everything is digitized and control is taken away, decision-making is taken away from human beings and placed in the hands of algorithms, then there's no democracy per se. Those who control the algorithms will control society. All of this is going on, and it's going on now. But meanwhile, we're told, evil Putin might do X, Y, or Z. Look over here, look over there. It's classic distraction tactics. And the key point is the one that you make, that it's no longer the case that you have different ruling classes of different countries opposed to one another. to the extent that they might fundamentally go to war with one another. Globalization has changed all of that. And when you look back over 150 years of transnational class relations, one thing which has always been the case is that nominal rivals, nominal enemies, different ruling classes, they will very quickly put aside their differences if there is a genuine working class threat that needs to be put down. This goes all the way back to 1871 and the Paris Commune. France and Germany had just been at war with each other. And then you have this uprising in Paris, and the two countries, the two states combine to crush it. But there are many other examples throughout history. Was it 14, 15 different countries sending in armies after the October Revolution to make sure that communism could never really be instituted in any authentic fashion in that country. And of course, the result was a disaster. Or during the Cold War, when there were insurrections in Hungary and East Germany in 1956 and 1953, you would have thought that would be a key opportunity for the United States and its allies to make headway against the Soviet Union, to capitalize on this discontent with the Soviet system. And instead, the opposite was the case. And I have a chapter in my Wall Street book about levels of collaboration between the US and the USSR during the Cold War. And again, this kind of black-white idea, US versus USSR, capitalism versus communism, this very dichotomous way of thinking, is all very misleading, because at a fundamental level, the two sides were on the same page when it came to suppressing the international working classes. And so with globalization, over the course of many decades now, we have seen society being knitted together and integrated increasingly transnationally. And with that, resistance becomes increasingly transnationalized to the point of becoming global. And particularly post 1968, when you had kind of Paris 1968 in the West and the Prague Spring in the East, a moment of major crisis on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Particularly since then, you've seen the transnationalization also of ruling class power structures. When you think about organizations like the Bilderberg Group or the Trilateral Commission or the World Economic Forum, all attempts to better coordinate capital and capitalist interests on a transnational scale. There had been some question, perhaps until 2020, as to whether the West, in inverted commas, was still kind of fundamentally at odds with the kind of Russia, China, or BRICS axis, potentially. And of course, the history of Western imperialism kind of feeds into that way of looking at things. But I think ultimately the logic of all of this, and it's been this way, this logic has been evident really for many decades, if you think about it, is that as these processes of transnationalization continue, from a ruling class perspective, the only way of keeping a global population of reportedly 8 billion people in check ultimately is a world state. The problem that they have had ever since 1945 is that people live in different nations, different local communities, and so on. People don't really tend to identify themselves as world citizens or whatever. And so I think many of these manufactured global crises, like climate change, like the global war on terror, like global pandemics, etc., are designed precisely to institute a sense of global consciousness, a sense that we're all facing the same problems together, that we all need to buy into the same solutions.
So, like, no one sovereign will be able to deal with this crisis, because it's something that attacks humanity, attacks the earth, etc., etc. Right? I mean, that's part of the game.
That is part of the game. And the idea is that different ruling classes, they may at one level be at odds with one another. They may have their differences, but fundamentally, they all know now that they all have to combine and they all have to work together if they are to maintain their power and their rule. They fundamentally have to cooperate, and this
That's
is
what
why. Yeah, go ahead.
That's what I wanted to ask you. Are we talking about like a ruling class which is monolithic, or do they have like different denomination? Because, for example, the technocratic movement in the early 30s, it seems like they reached a dead end. They were not able to produce the results they wanted of social engineering because they didn't have yet the technology to support it. And yet, it seems like there are other groups of so-called roundtable groups or whatever. So, are we talking about one group or different groups who eventually realize that they have to utilize the same ideology and methods to perpetuate this war on humanity?
Oh, I think we're dealing with different groups, but a fundamental class logic, which is beyond the power of any of those groups to change. For sure, you can identify many of these secret societies, for example, or different elements within different ruling classes. You have different factions within different ruling classes. A lot of competition. There's a lot of vying for, better seat at the table, and so on. There's a lot of ruthless competition goes on between them. All of that is, of course, the case. I'm not trying to simplify things too far, but at the same time, all of their power is jeopardized if there is worldwide revolution. And I think that's ultimately what they are now afraid of. It's extremely difficult for a relatively minuscule number of people in the population to control 8 billion people. This is a war of the few against the many. They're reliant on their technological means of control to do this. But the fundamental character of the Omniwar is a war which is being waged by relatively few, disproportionately powerful people against the rest of humanity, with a view to subjugating and ultimately enslaving it via technocratic means. And so it's no surprise to see that these digitization of government measures are being rolled out everywhere. Russia is no different. China was what Ian Davis calls the world's first technator, kind of a way of testing out technocratic measures such as social credit scoring, facial recognition, etc. These measures are being rolled out all across the world, and they're being rolled out against the people. Total surveillance is not a good thing. I shouldn't need to have to say this, but it's coming in everywhere, not least through the fact that so many interactions do take place online these days, where they can be monitored, recorded, fed into databases and analyzed and so on. This is all happening. And so, yeah, the fundamental structural logic that has changed over the last century is I don't think we're going to see major wars between nation states anymore. You may get conflicts which appear to be that way. Russia, Ukraine, for example, gives the appearance of the old logic still being intact. But I mean, that was a very peculiar conflict in many ways. It wasn't kind of an all-out war. It was waged in a very different fashion. Mm-hmm. The more fundamental logic, while these geopolitical tensions and wars do persist, they do go on. The point I make is that the more fundamental nature of the war is the global class war. That is fundamentally what is taking place now. That's why that phrase "global class war" is in the first 5 words of my COVID book, because that is ultimately what this is. Mm-hmm. And people have to. When you see the logic of it, it helps you to cut through some of the noise. There's a bit of a debate going on at the moment within the alt media regarding the BRICS and whether we should look to Russia and China and be grateful for their allegedly stabilizing role in the world system now. We've had this kind of out of control West, whose ruling classes fund Nazis and so on. And there are those who argue, well, maybe it's a good thing that Russia and China are becoming more powerful now, that the West is becoming less powerful. Maybe there are things we could learn from Russia and China, almost as though they offer some kind of meaningful alternative. I'm on the opposite side to that. I think that's a false way of looking at things. I think it verges on pro-Russian and pro-Chinese propaganda. And I think that actually the same things are fundamentally happening across all countries now. And it's the ruling classes of all countries, all states, are deploying measures which are increasingly aimed against the people in all kinds of ways, not least the propaganda to distract them and make them not realize what's happening.
Yes. And especially, I think that China is eventually going to be the model that we are going to copycat. I would like to go back to what you said about Ukraine, because I'm not informed about that, about the creation of this gulag state, a digital state. Can you tell us a little more about it? What's happening there?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, wasn't it, when the COVID operation was kind of wound down almost overnight in February 2022, and it disappeared from the top place in the news headlines after 2 years of just everything being COVID. And pretty much on the same day, Russia-Ukraine began. It's almost as though they have these things waiting to go.
In advance, yeah.
And so, there were many questions from the beginning about what that war was really all about. And of course, it's many levels, and there are lots of different ways of looking at it. Beyond the geopolitical aspects of it, one way we can analyze it is through what it led to. And one thing that we do know is that about a year ago, I think it was February 2025, the Ukrainian digital state was announced. Mm-hmm. And it was heralded with much fanfare by a new organization called the Global Government Technology Center, which was founded by the World Economic Forum. The Global Government Technology Center has an interesting name because it's abandoning any pretense of being about global governance, which has been the term that's been used for decades. It's openly talking about global government, single, as in world state. And you can sense the technocratic nature of this because it's a technology center, global government through technology. It produced a white paper in May 2025 called The Agentic State, which has an interesting double meaning. On the one hand, it's referring to governments and states becoming more AI powered. And on the other hand, as Jacob Nordangard pointed out, the term agentic state you find in the psychology literature going back to the Milgram experiments in terms of outsourcing personal agency and responsibility. And this is very much what they're trying to get populations to do, just outsource that agency and responsibility and surrender it all to algorithms. And so with this Ukrainian digital state, it's being marketed as something which was resilient and was able to survive the war in Ukraine. Ukraine actually gave various peace prizes to organizations like Microsoft and Amazon Web Services as it started migrating all of its citizens' data in the early stages of that war. Ukraine became the first state where all digital records had the same legal status as written paper records. The worry about this is that the different areas of your life which you thought were being dealt with by different ministries or agencies and were essentially separate, increasingly are no longer separate. So you might think that your health records are in one place, your driving and transportation records are in another place, and so on. Well, not on this model. because the whole idea of the agentic state is that the AI will be able to work across all of these different domains. And so essentially it will know everything about you, certainly everything official. And again, this is a recipe for a totalitarian control system. Privacy vanishes altogether. Basically, everything that you do will be monitored, tracked, and controlled by algorithms. Everything you spend, all of your financial transactions, it can all be knitted together. They'll know where you were, when, what you were spending your money on, what you were saying online. It's the possibilities are really endless. So anyhow, this model was pioneered in Ukraine. There's a digital app for it called the Dia app, and you don't have to get one of these things yet. But increasingly, more and more ordinary functions in Ukrainian life apparently do depend on having it. So you're kind of, in a way, quietly coerced to get it. And then you have to live your life through the app and through the smartphone, which again is an increasing mechanism of control. Most people are both addicted and dependent on their smartphones, can't live without them. For me, these are, it's the primary weapon actually in the Omniwar. It's that which connects everybody to the grid automatically. So this is not a promising development, in my opinion. Nevertheless, it's being heralded as a triumph and as the model for all other states to follow. So when you look at the webpage for the Ukrainian digital state, when you look at the webpage for the Global Government Technology Center, they're very much presenting this as something that the rest of the world should be following. And indeed, the rest of the world is following. As I say, these ministries of digital transformation, or they're worded differently in different countries, but they're everywhere. And it's happening everywhere. And of course, even though it might look as though there are different developments in different parts of the world, the key idea is the term interoperability. You hear this term so often, and it doesn't matter really if you have a digital state being developed one way in Ukraine and another way in Israel, another way in the UK, provided they are all interoperable, the end result will be a single global centralized control system. And that's exactly what they're trying to build. And not just in terms of the things I've mentioned, but the financial system as well. It doesn't matter if you have stable coins in the United States or central bank digital currencies in other parts of the world, which may appear different from one another, provided they're all interoperable, the result will be what the Bank for International Settlements refers to as a global unified ledger. And at that point, whoever has control over the ledger will, as Augustine Carstens, the former head of the Bank for International Settlements, said in 2020, be able to attach conditionalities to your money, where you can spend it, what you can spend it on, even if you're allowed to spend it. And you see how that ties in with the social credit scoring. If you have the wrong views, you say the wrong things, produce too much dissident content, your social credit score goes down, your opportunities in life go down, what you can spend your money on becomes much more tightly restricted. And of course, it's not long under those conditions before everybody starts doing exactly what they're told, which of course is the ultimate goal for the ruling class all along. So this is really important. It's happening now. It's happening fast. The influence of AI is overwhelming, or at least it feels that way at the moment. But meanwhile, again, we're just being endlessly distracted by tales of what official enemies are up to.
Yes. What is your opinion about Trump, the administration of Trump, and the people who are surrounding him, those dark enlightenment? Because many people, for example, here in Israel, are looking towards Trump as a savior. And I think that he is actually the guy that brings about the major change, especially in the US, but it's going to affect everywhere. So how do you see Trump?
Yeah, I agree with you. He's the opposite of a savior figure. I don't trust him at all. I don't understand why anybody would, because he was given an opportunity in his first term, and all we saw was broken promises. He said he'd drain the swamp, and then he assembled the wealthiest cabinet in US history. He said he put Hillary Clinton in jail, and then as soon as he's elected, they're all good friends again.
Mhm.
I mean, the one lesson to draw from a character like Trump is that he lies. He makes promises with no intention of keeping them. He's a very disruptive figure. In some ways, he seems to be different from the brand of politician that preceded him. And there has been a very successful campaign, the MAGA campaign, to get millions of US citizens to invest their trust and faith and hope in this character.
Mhm.
But again, what's he actually doing? So for his second term, he comes in and on day one, he says, no, we're not signing up to the WHO pandemic treaty. Good. He says, we're not going to have a US CBDC. Good. Saying all of the right words. But then on day two, he's talking about mRNA-powered cancer vaccines. That's not good. He still refers to himself as the father of the vaccine. That's not good. It doesn't matter that there's no US CBDC, because as Aaron Day and others have argued, stable coins will achieve exactly the same result. He invited Palantir to deal with just about every major arm of government in the US. He brought Thiel and Musk right into the heart of things almost immediately in the second term. He is presiding over the advancement of technocracy in the United States. I'd advise following Patrick Wood on this, or Courtney Turner. I mean, they're right on this. So anyone who thinks that Trump is, going to save them, or that he's in some way challenging the system, I'm afraid is wrong. He is at the very heart of helping to institute technocracy, and one of the themes that I mention again and again in my work is deception. Everything is about deception. The whole Omniwar relies on deception, because if people could see what's going on, if they could realize what's happening and why, there would be mass revolution, mass resistance, possibly revolution, almost overnight. And that's what the ruling classes fear. And so instead, they provide us with fake hero figures to
Yeah.
rally behind. They provide us with kind of fake debates, meaningless distractions where people get very heated about certain issues, but it never gets on to the most important issues, which are the global class war and the institution of technocracy.
Yeah, it's amazing that among the people who are awake after the COVID nonsense, people forgot that he is the one who pushed the warp speed operation.
Yeah.
So he's responsible for that from beginning to end. I would like to focus again on the psychological operation, and maybe to speak a little bit about the Tavistock Institution and what you call menticide. So what are the techniques are used to kill the individual mind, and how to make people follow orders, and basically make people stop thinking for themselves, lose their critical abilities? If you can give specific examples, because I think people are not aware of this.
Yeah, well, menticide isn't my term. It goes back to Jost Merlo, who fled the Nazi regime many decades ago, and the phrase that he used to characterize it was "rape of the mind," which, again, when we're thinking about continuities between the Nazis and those who were recruited from the Nazi regime after 1945. What is MK Ultra but the rape of the mind? When you look at the kind of techniques which were being pioneered, advanced under MK Ultra, there were two key elements to it. One of them had to do with what the psychologist Ewan Cameron called depatterning. This is a form of mind rape. You take the existing mind and you scramble it. so that anything which gives it coherence and structure, continuity, gets depatterned. Essentially, you're trying to create a kind of blank slate, and they use some horrific ways of doing that. Electrocution, and so on. And then the other part of it was to do with reprogramming. And in some cases, they would just play the same message over and over on repeat, 24/7 for days on end, in a bid to try and find out, if that person could be programmed with these messages. And it does get really horrific in that context, because you start dealing with some other kind of child abuse techniques and so on. Not just experimenting on kids, but telling them that they might be responsible for the death and suffering of others. So these are techniques of trauma now, trauma-based mind control. And I get into all of that in chapter 3 of my book. Again, it all came back during COVID. Don't go out into the park because you might kill granny. This was actual UK government NHS propaganda at the time.
It's such a cynical use of guilt and people attacking each other instead of recognizing again the hand that pushing everything.
Correct. Yeah, guilt and trauma. Now, I mean, the range of techniques which have been developed and which were deployed during COVID are so vast that I'm currently writing volume 2 of my COVID book. Volume 1 was 400 pages long, and it goes into great detail about many techniques which were used, and that's only half the story. It's hard to know where to even begin, but you mentioned Tavistock, and I do start with Tavistock in chapter 2 of volume 1, because they were very big on stress and shock. So after World War One, it was realized that soldiers who had experienced shell shock were more psychologically susceptible afterwards. Now, instead of trying to put this to a kind of genuine public health purpose, a leading figure connected with the Tavistock Institute at the time, John Rawlings Rees, military figure actually, immediately identified the potential of this for social control. And he got involved with the Rockefellers, and particularly after 1945 went on to assume a central position in the global psychiatry profession, which is very troubling when you understand these origins. Now, what the Tavistock Institute did in the mid-20th century, and this was kind of after MK Ultra, in fact, almost seamlessly after the end of MK Ultra, or the official end of MK Ultra, I should say, it started to develop techniques for controlling not only individuals, or manipulating, I should say, not only individuals, but groups or even entire societies. And it had been interested in this immediately after 1945, for example, going into kind of war-torn areas, disaster zones, places where societies had been ripped apart, and looking at potential means of psychological manipulation under those conditions. And some of these techniques were actually used by first Britain in places like Malaya, Kenya, and by the US in Vietnam and elsewhere. They found, for instance, one thing which was particularly effective was relocating people and keeping them hungry. And this would make them much more susceptible to manipulation. But they also pioneered a concept. This was Emery and Trist in the 1960s. I think in 1963, they came out with the idea of permanent social turbulence. So what they realized was that if you can keep a society in a permanent state of stress, kind of regular shocks and so on, then it becomes less resistant and more malleable to the kinds of ideas that you want it to have. And it's really kind of from that period that you can look at what's been taking place in Western societies with the false flag terrorism of the 1970s and so on. Fast forward to today, where it's just endless shocks of different kinds, disease and terrorism, financial crisis, fear of this, fear of that. And Naomi Klein, in her book, The Shock Doctrine, she recognizes how these kinds of techniques have been used in multiple societies all across the world in response to, for example, a financial crisis, a natural disaster like Hurricane Erin, an event like 9/11. And she was pretty on the ball back then in terms of how these events can be used for social control purposes. She lost her way soon afterwards when she got involved with the Rockefeller Fund. But that's a different story. And then again, take it all the way through into COVID, and you find some of the exact same techniques being used. The lockdowns, one of the things they did was create a sense of isolation. You can go all the way back to the torture manuals, developed the Kubak manual, which came out of the MK Ultra program. And sure enough, isolation is one of the key techniques that you use on prisoners if you want to break them down mentally. Disruption of familiar routines, again, kind of links to the de-patterning, the creation of a strange and unfamiliar and kind of uncanny, frightening kind of environment. Well, that's certainly the case when everyone is wandering around wearing those wretched blue surgical face masks. And so when you know the history of these techniques, what I do in the COVID book is to show how they were actually deployed during the COVID operation. And I mean, all of that's just chapter 2. The trauma-based stuff is chapter 3. Use of fear is chapter 4. Cognitive attack and scrambling cognition was chapter 5. Weaponized deceit was chapter 6. And creating social divisions and mass paranoia, chapter 7. So there's a huge amount to say. And as I say, I'm now writing volume 2, and I'm kind of dealing with cult psychology and applied behavioral psychology and many other things. So what I find really disturbing about all of this, and again, this cannot be by accident, it has to be by design, the fact that all of these techniques were all rolled out all together requires a huge amount of premeditation and planning. And that proves to me that there are some highly malevolent actors who wish us harm and have been actively attacking us in all kinds of devious, hidden ways. And again, most people think, there was a terrible pandemic and that's the end of it. No. It was a psychological attack on the population.
To prepare the ground for the technocracy.
Yes, and you have to say it's been successful. Because if you have a population which is confused, debilitated, demoralized, stressed, of course, stress has physical impacts. The whole shock of everything that happened in COVID, the kind of ruination of relationships. Many people at different kind of stages of awareness in their journey have found that they simply can't talk to one another. Mm-hmm. For those who are still trapped in what I call Camp 1, the kind of mainstream propaganda, and they can't see outside of it, it's almost impossible to have a conversation with somebody like that if you have learned to see through the
recognize us as biological threat, as terrorists, basically.
That's right. And so we've had these dreadful divisions running through, close friends formerly and families and so on. I'm sure most of the audience will be able to resonate with that in one form or another.
Yeah.
All of that has been going on. And as I say, meanwhile, the overarching plan is the institution of global technocracy. So now they're going for it, particularly since 2025. They're really going for it with these digital ministries of transformation. Does anybody, how many people, what percentage of the population has any idea that this is going on, that this is the agenda, that this is the game for all the marbles, that these measures are being introduced not to make the public more safe or secure, or to help it in some way, but actually to subjugate it and make it part of a potentially irreversible totalitarian control system. It's absolutely imperative that people wake up and understand this. But of course, they're in a much worse position to be able to do so if their minds have been attacked through menticidal techniques going back decades. So another feature of psychological warfare historically is it tends to be the prelude to the real thing, the more serious, kind of harder physical elements of war. And I made that point in the COVID book. If the populations of the different countries of the world have all been attacked in this manner psychologically, what does that portend going forwards? And I think, well, I worry very, very strongly actually about what the near future might hold, because they are going for it now, and there will be resistance. And I think that the kind of measures which will be introduced in response could be really, really hard and really harsh.
Do you really see resistance? Because I see people like you, of course, that I salute you, as I said earlier, for your incredible work and what you sacrifice to be able to promote this truth. But when I observe the groups here in Israel of people who walk to the realization that we are under attack, it seems like they didn't even arrived to the battlefield. There is no battlefield. They are busy with their day-to-day survival. They are very entertained, really, all the time entertained, isolated, and it seems like they don't even fully understand the scope of the challenge ahead. And I used to have a resisting group in England. We had about 25,000 members in England, and on the Telegram. And during 2021, it was alive and vivid, and people were like so caring. And now the groups broke apart, and we have, instead of 25,000, access to about 1,000 people who are completely passive. So do you really see the resistance that we require to be able to change what's coming?
Yeah, I understand your point. And I think it's been part of the evil genius of those behind this to have successfully, it seems, disarmed resistance groups since early 2022. There was a point where, after millions of people had all been marching together in many cities all across the world,
Mm-hmm.
where you could definitely say there are obvious, clear signs of mass resistance here. The most notable one, I think, was the truckers' convoy in Canada, because everywhere it went, it brought thousands of people out in support. And so you saw all across the country that there was serious resistance.
Yes.
And that was great because it was done physically. It couldn't be hidden. Everything online, of course, can be manipulated. Numbers can be skewed and downgraded.
Yes.
So the point is, what happened to all of that? Because it wasn't just Canada; it was transnational. We had 1.5 million people marching through the streets of London, for instance. That's a pretty significant segment of the population. It was the largest protest that had been seen since the Iraq War. So clearly, there was resistance. Now, since then, by whatever means, it seems like the resistance, in inverted commas, has been kind of fractured and splintered. And of course, it began with Ukraine and people taking different sides vis-a-vis that conflict. The really big one, of course, was October the 7th, and how that managed to divide opinion.
Mm-hmm.
But what I think's also been going on is that some of the key voices, if you like, in the resistance movement have been co-opted. They've been gotten to. Whatever means are being used, the levels of coordination, at least among the resistance, have gone down.
Yes.
Now, does that mean that the level of resistance itself has gone down? I don't think so. I think that deep down, all those who protested against the COVID measures must know that there's something dreadfully wrong with society. They must know it doesn't just go away when COVID is stopped. It's a symptom of something far, far worse. And more people are kind of starting to wake up. I don't think it's a question of there not being resistance. I think the resistance is present and growing every day. And after all, once you see these things, you can't unsee them. There's no going back.
Yes.
If you have any kind of integrity or conscience about you, you can't see these things and then just turn away and bury your head in the sand. It affects you. It becomes part of your life. You have to do something about it. The problem that we have is the mechanisms for coordination seem to have been sabotaged through very clever means. And now there's no kind of obvious place to go. There's no kind of mass rallies taking place. Everything feels fractured and splintered. You just have all these different talking heads online and so on, and it can seem quite difficult. But again, that's by design. That the attempt always through the psychological operations is to make them, in inverted commas, seem omnipotent and to make us feel weak and dependent and vulnerable. And so we mustn't fall for that trap. We must always remember that we know for a fact from COVID that there are mass numbers of people who are seriously disenchanted with this system. The question is what to do in practical terms. And just to come back to Nazi Germany, one of the lessons there is that people never really knew how strong the resistance to the regime was. Firstly, because everyone was too scared to speak out against it. But also, even some of those who would most fervently appear to be supporting the regime in their public pronouncements and so on, even some of those might have been putting on an act and might privately have detested the regime. So it was really hard to know. And again, I think this is a symptom of totalitarianism, that it's difficult to know how strong the resistance is. It's difficult to know who's in it. It's difficult to know where it is. But objectively, in terms of the class relations, the situation is in our favor. There are so many more of us than there are of them. What they are trying is so audacious and so brutal and so awful. The implications are so dire for the rest of humanity. I'd be very surprised if they actually managed to pull it off. The problem is the subjective consciousness. How many people are in a mental place to be able to register this and take action accordingly? And again, that's where the psychological warfare, I think, has been quite effective. But no, I do think that there's serious resistance, and indeed there has to be. That the stakes are too high for there not to be.
I hope you're right. I really do. Let's go back to technocracy and to try to explain to the audience what does it really look like. So maybe you can explain what is a digital enclosure, the smart cities, what will happen when the money will be replaced by energy credits. Please elaborate on that.
Okay. Well, technocracy as a concept goes back to the early 1930s, 1934. And it was coined by M. King Hubbard, who was later responsible for peak oil theory.
Which is a lie, right?
Which is a lie, yeah. They were writing in a context, again, the kind of post-Wall Street crash, Great Depression context, massive crisis of capitalism. And the fundamental problem is, well, how can we create a more stable system one that isn't subject to the booms and busts of an economy where everything is determined by, where price is determined by supply and demand, for example. And so they came up with a whole different way of thinking about economics and social organization. And they called it technocracy, which in their own words is the scientific management of society. So the idea is if you have,
Forgive me, I think they are actually saying social engineering, no?
yes, that's exactly what flows from it. It's exactly
Mhm.
what flows from it. So instead of thinking about social organization in terms of democracy, the will of the people, debate and discourse in parliament, and so on, it would be better, allegedly, to place the control in the hands of an elite group known as the technocrats. Now, the technocrats will have access to um, data about everybody and everything, and can allocate resources more effectively. So instead of the price being determined by supply and demand, they came up with the idea of an economy being based on the energy cost of production. So just there, you can kind of start to see the first shoots of sustainability and these kinds of ideas. And so it's all about maximizing efficiencies in society. One simple example has to do with your car. Your car spends 96% of its life sitting on your driveway. Only 4% of the time is it actually being used.
Mhm.
Well, what a dreadfully inefficient waste of resources. Excuse me. So wouldn't it be better if we had a system where you could use an app, for example, to just summon a car? And particularly in a world of driverless cars, if such a thing comes about, a car will just turn up when you need it. You can do whatever you need with it, drop it off wherever, and society could be run that way. There would be far few vehicles on the road, far less maintenance and upkeep, and so on. It's all much more efficient. Now, the point is that in order to have that level of knowledge in real time about what everybody is up to and where all of these resources are and how much energy it costs to produce them all, the technologies for monitoring all of that were simply not available in the 1930s. It was just an idea at that stage. Nevertheless, it was quite an attractive idea to the ruling classes, and they kept harping on the theme of social engineering and the scientific management of society. And in the mid 20th century, you saw ideas about scientific dictatorship emerging in the works of Bertrand Russell, for example, and Aldous Huxley, and Zbigniew Brzezinski with his idea of the technotronic era. So this way of thinking, using technology to be able to manage and control society as opposed to democracy, is very desirable from that ruling class perspective. Now, more recently in history, we've seen the rise of smart technologies. A misnomer, because you
Wow,
have to be.
technology is stupid people.
Yeah, that's
Forgive me.
right.
Yeah.
I think so. And again, these technologies make life more convenient. You can have your smart home. You can have your Alexa device. You can be so lazy that you can lie in bed and just tell the lights to go out, and Alexa will turn your smart light bulbs out, and so on. You can be tethered to your smartphone 24/7. You can get your central heating to come on while you're on your way home from work or whatever it may be. How wonderfully convenient and efficient. The problem with it all is that it increasingly tends towards a system where everything you do can be monitored and recorded, right down to how much energy your fridge or your toaster is using, what times of day you use your washing machine. This kind of very granular level of detail. On top of that, the kind of store cards that you might use at the grocery store are recording what kind of things you like to purchase. And again, all of this data can ultimately be centralized and to create psychographic profiles about each citizen and every single aspect of their life. This is pretty frightening stuff. I mean, Facebook apparently, just based on the information that you feed it into Facebook, Facebook will know before you do that you're about to break up with your partner.
Really?
Yeah. So there's an awful lot of power comes with data. This is why they say data is the new oil. If you have enough data, you can do well. I mean, the sky's the limit, really, in terms of what you can do with all of that data. So, in a technocratic control system, it's where everybody is essentially connected to the control grid all the time. That all areas of life become digitized. They all go onto the control grid, and they're all managed through algorithms and AI. Once you're onto that system, it's too late, really. If you can't function in society, if your money's going to be turned off, if you don't behave well, you'll probably end up doing as you're told. And we're not very far away from that kind of system. I mean, at the moment, another aspect we haven't touched on yet is the digital ID, which is the linchpin to all of this. It's absolutely essential to bring the system in to have a digital ID because it connects all of the things I've been talking about. Well, of course, they're pushing for it now. There's been a big debate in the UK about this when Keir Starmer said that he wanted to bring it in. Tony Blair's been wanting to bring it in for decades.
What about Nigel Farage and the Reform Party? Are they? I don't trust them. Forgive me. I think
No.
they are. What's your opinion about it?
It's just like Trump.
Yes.
So people lose faith in the two mainstream parties. This is happening all over the world for good reason. The democratic system has been exposed as largely a sham, especially in recent years. It doesn't matter what party is in charge. The same fundamental things keep happening: imperialist wars, austerity at home. £3 billion a year to Ukraine, while our pensioners are, left with insufficient fuel to heat their homes. This kind of thing. Doesn't matter who's in charge. All of this goes on regardless. It doesn't matter who was in charge during COVID. If it was a nominally left-wing or nominally right-wing government, they all did the same thing. And so people are rightly disenchanted with the system, or at least the major two-party system. And so new alternatives are offered. And Elon Musk.
The third way, basically.
Well, that's slightly problematic because that's a Tony Blair term, which has its own kind of connotations in this country, at least. But a third-party alternative, should we say?
I think the third way was originally the fascist way. If not communist and not capitalistic, then you get fascism, which is a combination of the two somehow.
Right, that has an extra layer of complexity to it then.
Yeah.
Yeah, but in terms of reform, I mean, it did extremely well in the local elections here in the UK. It won victories up and down the country, which again is probably reflecting people's disenchantment with Labour and the Conservatives. But the idea is, we just need to vote the right way, and we can find our ways out of these problems. If only we had Nigel Farage in charge. Yeah. And again, it's starting to look a little bit like, Trump's going to save us kind of thing. It doesn't matter who you've got in charge,
they're all criminals, yes.
And they're all controlled as well. And someone like Farage, he tries to, I like a pint. I'm a kind of a good British bloke. You can trust me. But he's enormously wealthy privately. He has his own ambitions and aspirations. And so I think reform is just being used to prolong the slow death of liberal democracy. And I'm sure many people have bought into it. Many people trust it. They will be disappointed in the long run. It will come to the key issues again. Promises will be broken. Things won't happen that they were expecting to happen. And this is just how it's done. And of course, until you have got the technocratic system in place, you have to find any means possible to maintain the public's trust in the democratic system itself, to keep that illusion of democracy going, even though it's nothing more than a husk at this stage. And so you keep offering new parties, new figures, saviour figures, apparent alternatives, and you keep people kind of in that trap. And again, in so doing, they're not seeing what is actually taking place.
And back to the digital ID, I would like for you to speak a little more about it so people can fully understand the danger. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
sure. I mean, earlier I mentioned the danger of all of the different areas of your life which you thought were being kind of where the data you thought was being kept separate, your tax records, your medical records, your driving license records, etc. Um, well, all of this will be brought together on a single profile, which is your digital ID. Um, and at that point, there is a marker where it simply has to be fed into the system, and whoever is on the other end will be able to see all the records about you. In fact, it probably won't even be a person. Yeah. It'll be AI. It will have access to every key data element about you. Again, one of the the principles of liberal democracy involve a lack of government overreach and a respect for privacy. Well, these things are just being abolished de facto in front of our eyes. It used to be the case that people, or some people, would give anything for 15 minutes of fame. Whereas today, 15 minutes of privacy would be nice, because it's almost impossible to find any real privacy. And the digital ID only enhances that. It's just a means for the state to instantly have all that access to about your life in real time as well. The levels of manipulation and control that come with that are truly frightening and indeed totalitarian.
Mhm. What about the net zero movement and how they are going to utilize the 5G, 6G? How it's like the Internet of Bodies. Everything is connected and eventually connected to the digital ID. What about these movements?
Well, I mean, net zero is another scam, isn't it?
Mhm.
Um, this kind of whole idea about carbon. Um, Carbon dioxide constitutes 0.04% of the atmosphere. And if it goes down to 0.02 or something, it becomes dangerous for human life. So the idea that we need to reduce it to avoid apocalyptic disaster, to me, is obvious nonsense and mockery and a form of humiliating anyone who goes along with it. Actually, another psychological technique
Right.
that they use. What it is being used for is economic purposes. The idea of carbon credits, for example, which again ultimately factor into control mechanisms that have to do with sustainability, ESG scoring, and so on. And so it's part of a narrative which ultimately is used for control. So we need to be clear about that. The Internet of Bodies, which you mentioned, is a slightly different topic, but it goes hand in glove with the idea of technocracy and everything being monitored in real time. I've already talked about most people's inability to be without their smartphone for any period of time. Um, the Internet of Bodies, and specifically as well the Internet of Bio Nano Things, would take this to a new level. So the Internet of Bodies is just about connecting everything with everything. It could be bollards and streetlights. It could be toasters and kettles. But it could also be human bodies, and this is where it starts to get pretty worrying. There's a concept, a military concept called network-centric warfare, which again is all about connecting everything. So if you have all of your different elements of military hardware all connected up together, you can use speed of networked information to achieve military advantages. You don't just have to have, bigger tanks and more powerful guns or whatever. You can win wars informationally through those means. The really worrying idea is that human bodies themselves might be made part of this network, the control network. And that's not just mere speculation. We've had over a decade now of well-funded academic research on what's called the Internet of Bio-Nano Things. And this essentially is about introducing syringe injectable nanotechnologies into the human body, which are capable with communicating with an external network. Now, there is some debate about how feasible that actually is and what developments have actually been taken, but the intent is undeniable that they are seeking to do this. And again, in the COVID context, you can only wonder what the true aim of the shots was, because there certainly wasn't any sound medical or ethical reason to try and shoot whatever that stuff was into as many people as possible worldwide. When you look at it through a military lens, as I do, you have to start wondering about the potential weapon function of injections in the contemporary era, and in a whole new way. I mean, not just in terms of potentially, making people sick or whatever. I mean, these kinds of concerns have been around for a long time, but in terms of actual being able to inject technologies. So this is a troubling proposition, and we do know many people became magnetic on the injection site, which really shouldn't have happened. Was this just down to bad manufacturing processes and detritus from the vaccine, which shouldn't have been there? Who knows? But when COVID began, Yuval Noah Harari, the kind of World Economic Forum ideologue, he came out in March or April 2020, right at the start, and he openly said surveillance has gone under the skin. And you can imagine North Korea in 2030, where, if you don't even have to say anything, if you just kind of emotionally react the wrong way to what the dear leader is saying, the system will know. That was a strange moment to come out with a statement like that. And so as preposterous and as wild and as sci-fi as some of these ideas might seem to the average person, you need to understand, firstly, that this research has been going on for a long time, and secondly, that there is a possibility of classified military technology being involved, which tends to be decades ahead of publicly available science and technology. And thirdly, you do have to ask, what the obsession with injections is since 2020. When you put it all together, and you also include the empirical investigations into what was found in the shots under the microscope and through spectroscopy, that's extremely worrying, because there's all kinds of material in there that shouldn't be there, and which appears to self-assemble in some cases, appears to be EMF responsive in some cases, appears to be technological in different forms. I would advise in the first instance, look at the work of David Nixon on this. He's been investigating this very seriously now for a number of years, and the results are deeply, deeply troubling. And the transhumanist agenda, essentially merging human beings with machines, it plays into that as well. So these ideas, which do seem sci-fi at first, I think we need to be taking extremely seriously.
Do you think that they will be able to put whatever they put in the injections in, how do you call it, aerosol, like in the air, just to spread it in the air somehow?
Well, who knows? What we know, I mean, you can go back to 2001 and the NASA planning document written by Dennis Bushnell, which got leaked online, which seems extraordinarily prescient in many ways. In 2001, this was 3 months before 9/11, Bushnell was predicting the beginning of what he called the IT bio-nano era in 2020. Well, what is the IT bio-nano era? It's connecting human beings to the internet, essentially, in 2020. And COVID began right then. Mm-hmm. Also in that document, he prefaces the document again by saying, this is no pixie dust. These ideas are not just plucked out of thin air. There's reason to suspect either these things are being worked on or should be achievable within a certain time frame. And he said the implementation of these kinds of things can take about 15 years, and that was mentioned in relation to smart dust, which again would have seemed, most people wouldn't have believed in such a thing in 2001. Well, in 2015, right on schedule, again, IBM announces the development of smart dust. And then 2 years later, James Giordano, the Pentagon neuroscience advisor, told the troops, the cadets rather, at West Point, all about the potential of smart dust, nanodust, to come down from the air and find its way into human beings. It can cross the blood-brain barrier. That's another feature of this nanotech. Normally, the blood-brain barrier is very strong and resilient, but nanoscale material is so small it can find its way through and be weaponized. Giordano is telling the cadets, and he talks about its potential ability to debilitate or even kill targets. So again, how much of that is just talk and just rhetoric? How much of it is real? Because if that's feasible, then we're living in a very frightening world, aren't we? And that's before you start asking questions about whatever it is that's being sprayed from the skies.
Yeah, I guess we'll find out about that as well quite soon. Something which really worries me in the world of AI and this transhumanism, technocracy, and all the rest of it, eventually the majority of people are going to become some kind of useless class. They are not going to be needed. What is your take about that? And how does a universal basic income play into that? And for how long and under what criterions?
Well, if you go back to the original vision of the technocrats in the 1930s, whatever you may think about their ideas, I don't think that they were intending it as a totalitarian control system at that time. Because one of the things that they mention is that increased efficiencies all across society should result in increased human leisure time. So depending on how society is run, you can either look at it in terms of what Harari calls a useless class, which has no economic function anymore in society and essentially needs to be entertained by video games and drugs, he says, that's a humane alternative to genocide, apparently, according to Curtis Yarvin. That's one way of looking at it. Or if society will run in a better way, even if we were to get to that kind of situation where the technologies are creating so many efficiencies, shouldn't it be used to create leisure time for everybody? How many people are caught up in the rat race and so-called bullshit jobs that they don't want to be doing, all these meaningless things? In a sense, this should be a good thing. If the technologies were managed responsibly.
Mm-hmm.
The problem we've got is the class relations. There is no desire or intention on behalf of the ruling class to use these technologies for the emancipation of humanity. There is only the intent to use them for total subjugation and control. So in and of themselves, I don't think the technologies are good or bad. Now, the universal basic income that you mentioned is likely to be a way of getting people onboarded onto the new system, because as more and more people are put out of work by AI, and again, it can affect so many sectors, increasingly people will become financially dependent. And if they are offered UBI, and of course there have been many pilot studies of UBI across many countries since COVID, again establishing the kind of feasibility of the idea and of its practicality. If people are offered enough money to live on for free by the state, well, that's a much more attractive proposition than worrying about how they're going to live. And all they've got to do in exchange is just sign on to the system. So accept all of the digital ID, the digital wallets, and everything, and you can be essentially, managed as part of the herd.
Yes.
You lose the agency and the responsibility and control over your own life to a large extent, but you just kind of placidly go along with it because that's all there is left for you at that stage. And again, this is the kind of eventuality that we need to prevent. But you can see, the devious kind of planning for this. Was it Sam Altman came out with that orb where you'd be awarded free cryptocurrency? Was it the World Coin? And all you had to do was consent to an iris scan.
Just that.
Just
Yeah.
that biometric ID again, and they're very, very keen that this digital ID is biometric because then it is tied explicitly to you, and it can't be hacked. And again, it's a totally kind of safe and secure form of doing things. And I do fear that a possible future false flag would be to just take the internet down for a day or two.
They are practicing it in Iran right now for 4 days already.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Right. I'd not heard about that.
It's
I imagine that if that were to happen, there would be significant chaos, and order would be restored, essentially by saying, well, there have been too many cyber attacks, too many internet outages. The system's too insecure. We need to make it more secure. We have the means of doing so, and essentially going online will require biometric identification, so we know exactly who everybody is when they're online.
yes.
Which again would be a dreadful result. But I read a 2023 U.S. Naval Defense Planning document. It was a kind of scenario planning thing, featuring the Japanese island of Okinawa. But it's a very similar kind of scenario, so you can already see that they're thinking along those lines.
Yes. You mentioned earlier the ESG, the environmental social governance, which I'm sure they will change to government instead of governance. Can you just explain about that as well? Because I think it's very important to understand how they are going to change the paradigm of corporation in the future.
Well, those are for companies, you see, and essentially it's the company version of social credit scoring. So, in other words, if you don't follow the rules and the guidelines and the regulations that we prescribe, then, for instance, you're going to find financing and funding much harder to come by. Business success will be less likely if you don't play ball, and it's just the company version for social credit scoring at an individual level. If you don't behave yourself, then you'll find it harder to get your children into the school you want them to go to. You get less preferential mortgage rates, etc., etc. There are a million different ways in which these things can be manipulated.
And they are also going to change the way the companies are being traded. Instead of shareholder, it's going to be I forgot the word in English. It's like there will be some group of elite who are going to speak on behalf of all the people who are basically being affected by the functioning and operation of a certain company. Not shareholding, but how do you call that?
I'm not sure.
I forgot. I will come back to that later.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to see what else, because you covered almost everything that I wrote. So what do we do? That's actually very important. How do mass non-compliance, like what is the solution in your opinion?
Well, I think mass non-compliance is the most obvious solution, but of course it's easier to say than do. One thing to keep in mind is that to institute all of these technocratic measures is largely reliant on the public's consent to this happening. People make themselves easier to monitor and control just by having a smartphone, and running their whole lives through that machine. As soon as you stop to reflect, what's happening to all the data, every keystroke you make, everything that you feed into it, it's well known that the smartphones listen to you as well, and tailor adverts and so on to things that you've been saying. Really, really creepy. But of course, you only have to move from economics and marketing to politics to realize that they're just devices that allow the intelligence agencies to spy on you all the time. So, the most simple starting place really would be to get rid of your smartphone. I've been putting this challenge out consistently for many months now. Only 4 people have got back to me and say that they've managed to do it. So, have you owned a smartphone since 2020? Have you been able to ditch it? I only have heard from 4 people. I've heard from plenty who've said that they've not been able to do it. So that shows part of the scale of the problem, and they are designed to be deliberately addictive. The notifications have a dopamine kind of function that's, it's similar with cocaine or whatever, in terms of what it does in the brain. The kind of constant scrolling it's almost like the slot reels on an arcade machine. Deliberately addictive, and then there are certain jobs now where you have to have a smartphone in order to be able to do your job. Or certain banks where you have to have a smartphone if you want to use their services. So I understand that it's difficult to get by without these things, but once you see them as weapons, which they are in the Omniwar, no doubt about it, then getting rid of them is key. But getting rid of everything's smart. Do you want everything about your life being monitored, tracked, and controlled? So if it were to reach a level, a critical mass of awareness, and enough people were to reject these technologies, then technocracy becomes unenforceable. So yes, mass non-compliance is the way forward, and this can all be done through peaceful means. Mm-hmm. The problem, of course, is what we talked about earlier in terms of being able to reach enough people and get them to take action. That's the really tricky part. I often say that it's not really my place to tell any individual person, exactly what they should or should not be doing. But one of the advantages of the Omniwar is because it's being fought across all domains of human existence, you individually will be able to do something to resist. And that's up to you really to work out, what your gifts and what your skill set is. And different people are good at different things. But if you remember what Solzhenitsyn wrote about totalitarianism, when he referred to the line between good and evil that flows through every human heart, what is happening right now is firmly on the side of evil. There's no doubt about that. So anybody with a conscience, anybody who takes a moment just to reflect and listen inwardly, will intuitively feel that there is something very, very bad taking place. And from that comes a moral responsibility to act. It's not enough to sit placidly on the sidelines or to watch talking heads like us online and then do nothing. You have to do something. That's the key thing, which I would implore everyone. Because if millions of people got up and started acting to resist this rapidly incoming totalitarian tyranny, the situation would change very, very fast. Again, coming back to the truckers' convoy, was it merely an accident that the COVID operation was wound down immediately after the Canadian truckers' convoy? Because it was such a clear mass act of resistance that the whole thing got swapped over for Ukraine. Again, if more people would get up and act and visibly show resistance, then it draws more people along with them, and it becomes a kind of self-perpetuating, self-reinforcing effect. That's what we really need to see. So, yes, I think there's both a moral obligation to act. There's also a strategic obligation or advantage. simply because there are so many of us and so few of them. So it doesn't take, one individual to, do something life-changing in order for effective resistance to be mounted. But if lots of people all did something, even if it's, relatively small acts, the cumulative effect would be enormous. But it's actually just getting up and doing something is the key.
I agree with you. At the minimum, they can support your work so you can continue to be an advocate of truth and freedom. Earlier, I forgot the term that I was looking for. I was talking about, again, I forgot,
Stakeholder
stakeholder.
capitalism.
Yes, stakeholder,
Yeah, yeah.
stakeholder compared with shareholders. And I'm really worried about these stakeholders because that gives them the ultimate power to speak on behalf of all the stakeholders who are
Mm.
basically all of us.
Yes, it's very, again, it's devious the way they do this, and this is the kind of Klaus Schwab fourth industrial revolution kind of
Mhm.
element to this. Presented as a good thing because shareholder capitalism allegedly results in kind of irresponsible practices and so on. So stakeholder capitalism is a way forward. We need to listen to all stakeholders involved, and this includes not only shareholders, but other business partners, corporations, but also the public, the third sector, charities, NGOs. All of these voices need to be taken into account, and it all goes into building what Ian Davis has referred to as the global public-private partnership. And I'd strongly encourage people to read his work on that. But again, this is essentially it tends towards the merger of states and corporations, somewhat like the fascist model. When they say that they'll consult with the public and so on, that always turns out to be a sham.
Alive. Yeah.
Yeah, the consultations are never meaningful. But it actually goes beyond fascism. Ultimately, what we're seeing today, because what we're seeing today is an attempt to privatize the state itself. It's a takeover by private interests of the state. So again, it's lovely sounding language, isn't it? Stakeholder capitalism. Everyone has a say. But what it really transfers to is the centralization of corporate power.
Yeah, and people like Curtis Yarvin will be able to speak on your behalf without ever listening to what you really want. And yeah,
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, the whole kind of dark enlightenment idea. I mean, it sounds preposterous when you first hear some of these terms like GovCorps and privatization of the state and running states as though they were businesses. Again, it's all linked to the idea of efficiency, but democracy goes completely out of the window. I've strongly been recommending Ian Davis's new book, The Technocratic Dark State, because it explains how these ideas, which might sound really quite wacky to some, are actually very close to the thinking of some of the most powerful actors, like Peter Thiel, for example. Yarvin is Thiel's kind of house philosopher, so to speak. And people like Musk and Thiel actually invoke these ideas to legitimize what they're doing. So however crazy they are, it's imperative that we understand them. And Davis does a terrific job in his book, not just of explaining the kind of intellectual roots of these ideas, but also how they are being implemented in practice in the world today, particularly in 2025. And there are all kinds of examples. One of the most surprising ones to me was the kind of so-called special economic zones, where very rich, powerful people are essentially carving out small enclaves, territories for themselves out of nation states and running it how they see fit. I mean, this is extraordinary to think that this could happen, but there are dozens and dozens of examples of this happening all across the world. So clearly, the nation state model is breaking down, clearly states are beginning to be privatized.
Is that what Trump is calling freedom cities?
That's just one example. That's the US example. But the outskirts of Sochi in Russia, in Nigeria, in China, there are dozens of these enclaves. There's even places like Liberland and Prospero, which the anarcho-capitalists are saying is such a great thing.
Mhm.
Not really. It's just on exactly the same model as everything I've just been describing. So remarkable things are happening in the world before our very eyes. But again, most people are too distracted by news headlines to even know what's going on.
Yeah. We spoke a lot about the psychological operations and the manticide, the rape of the mind, and the media and all the narrative that they are producing. What is your opinion about the use of public schooling and entertainment to basically destroy the mind of people and to atomize them?
Yeah,
Basically.
yeah. I mean, I think it's going to vary a lot country by country and system by system, and what specific schools you're looking at. It's clearly very troubling when the education system becomes politicized, for example, through trying to push woke agendas on children. That's an obvious problem, or the drag queen story time phenomenon. That kind of thing is obviously very bad. From my own experience in higher education, I mean, I have virtually a whole book's worth of content, which I need to finally get around to finishing someday, about the history of academia since 1945, particularly the social sciences, and particularly with an emphasis on the US, but showing how the social sciences over a period of many decades have become very tightly integrated with the national security state, to the extent that they don't, despite their own proclamations, they don't really act independently. They don't really speak truth to power. There's no kind of fearless, without fear or favor, pursuing the truth. There's no real academic freedom. Everything remains, coming back to Gleichschaltung, everything ultimately doesn't challenge the system. And that's something which I believe I have graphically exposed twice now. First with a journal article that I wrote on 9/11, asking why doesn't academia ask any serious questions about the events of 9/11, given this massive body of empirical evidence that there is to analyze. Read tens of thousands of times. And well, there are many answers to do with kind of institutionalization, not universities not being willing to be seen to be co-signing so-called conspiracy theorists, potential loss of reputation, potential loss of funding, etc. Again, all of the consequences that I explained earlier with relation to Gleichschaltung. But despite the fact, it's one of the most important events in the West, at least, of the 21st century, despite the massive amounts of evidence and the overwhelming significance of it all, academia just refuses to go there. And even though I pointed this out in a peer-reviewed paper, and even though the paper's been read tens of thousands of times, academics refuse to engage with the paper. So it's an amazing phenomenon to behold. I've exposed a real blind spot there. And similarly with COVID, my COVID book on the publisher's website has been downloaded, last time I checked, 328,000 times in 18 months, which is, for an academic book, it's absolutely off the charts.
Yes.
And again, this is one of the most important events in our lifetimes, COVID, and what that really was and what happened. And my book is a serious, highly researched and well-referenced, triple peer-reviewed academic text on this issue, offering an original and alternative perspective. You might have thought with 328,000 downloads, and that's just at the publisher's website alone, let alone everywhere else it's been traveling online, you might have thought that the academic community would have taken some interest in it. No. Crickets. Absolutely nothing. And so there are serious problems, I think, in the higher education system, at least. It won't challenge power. It won't speak truth to power. It's completely co-opted in that respect. I know less about the secondary education system, high schools and so on. But yeah, I mean, Chomsky, he said a long time ago, didn't he? What's the point in going to university? Is it really to learn stuff, find out about the world and so on? Or is it to be socialized into patterns of obedience and conformity? So you always meet the deadlines, you always make sure you write enough words, you always make sure that broadly speaking, you follow what your professors say and meet the rubric, etc. And he was saying that in large measure, it's more about that, so that the system helps to create better employees who will do as they're told when their boss tells them to do things. And he kind of has a point there. I used to give some quite large lectures to several hundred students at a time, and every now and again I would ask them, do a poll. Why are you at university? And one option would be, for the genuine love of learning. Another option would be just to get a job at the end, and a couple of other options. And it would always be about 72% would say, "Yeah, I just want a job at the end." So you have to wonder about the very nature of the education system. Furthermore, it's been vandalised, at least in the UK. The UK higher education system, money's been drained out of it since the 2008 financial crisis. Universities have become increasingly dependent on raising their own funds, firstly through tuition fees, but those have been frozen since 2012, so they're worth about a third less now than they used to be. So again, universities become ever more reliant on doing things like consultancy or providing services in inverted commas, and ever more desperate for research funding. Well, where does that come from? It comes from the major government organizations and the major kind of private foundations and so on, which means that all of that research getting done is then beholden to powerful interests, which again skews the entire direction of knowledge production away from a fearless investigation of the truth. So, yeah, I mean, I could go on all day about the woeful states of academia. And you did also mention film, I think, or culture.
The entertainment. I think the entertainment itself is being weaponized against us.
It absolutely is. Yeah, I touch on that a bit in my report, Omniwar, Exposing and Ending the Invisible War Against Humanity. Obviously, it stands to reason if you have multi-million-dollar film productions, they are going to have to meet various criteria of those who are putting the money in, which again, all will align with ruling class interests. And you have to wonder about the extent to which these films are increasingly harmful, actually. Not just in terms of propaganda, but in terms of the kind of the violence and just the kind of fracturedness of watching some of this stuff, or the artificiality of it all. I mean, I some years ago I put I think it was called Deadpool, and my son at the time I think was about 15 or something, and I think it had a 15 rating, something like this. So we put it on, and it was the most offensive, violent, sick, worthless movie. And I remember just thinking at the time, this is like, there's no way this should be a 15. It shouldn't even have been made. Nothing good can come out of this film which is being marketed at children. Seriously. And I wonder how much of, not just Hollywood, but other cultural productions are like this now, being deliberately weaponized to come back to the idea of menticide again. It's an assault against the psyche, and that's before you get onto all the stuff that Jason Christoff talks about in terms of very clever placing of subliminal messages or product placement or whatever else. So yeah, I mean, I have, as far as possible, just stopped consuming that stuff. Stop consuming the news. Don't go anywhere near the BBC other than to listen to football commentaries every now and again, but I always turn the news off in the middle. All of this stuff is an attack on the mind. I do consider it to be a form of mental poison. I do consider it to be particularly dangerous for children. I do think there's an imperative more than ever now for parents to be so careful about what they are letting their children watch. I mean, this is just life in the Omniwar, unfortunately.
Yes. Last question, if I may. I would like to hear your opinion about immigration,
Mhm.
especially in Europe, but it seems like a complete attack on the Western world, on its values, culture, institutions, and all the rest of it. What do you
Yeah.
think about those things?
Yeah, again, I get into this in my Omniwar report. Migration, I think, is another dimension of the Omniwar, another area of life in which we are being attacked. I was quite curious back in late 2022, early 2023, to actually analyze some of the claims that were being made about excessive levels of migration. Seeing some very troubling videos coming out of Ireland, for example, particularly Dublin. So I was asking myself, well, to what extent is this kind of right wing or possible far right wing propaganda? To what extent is there actually something in this? Because I could see how it would fit the logic of the Omniwar in terms of the kind of socially destabilizing effects that excessive migration can have. And so I went to the Office of National Statistics and I got the official data for the UK. What I found was staggering, really. Net migration into the UK only turns positive around 1994. So, in other words, there was no real migration issue either way before then. And then for about 28 years or so, the net level of migration into the UK was, I think, it was always within a range of somewhere. I think it was between about 170,000 to 330,000 people per year. So
Wow.
quite a large range, but we're talking a long period of time there. But it was always within that range. And then we get to Q3 of 2022, and it suddenly spikes, and it breaks clean out of this 330,000 upper band, and it's gone over 700,000, and that's just net.
700 just in the UK or
Just the UK, 700,000.
per year?
Yeah, right. And that's net. So the gross figure is over 1 million. Well, that's
That's committing
obviously.
suicide.
Well, it's certainly something very significant that you have to analyze, and I think some of the best work on this issue has been done by Simon Elmer. He's written a book called the Great Replacement.
Mhm.
Fact or conspiracy theory, something like this. And what I value about his work on this topic is, without any connection to me or anything, he talks about the class relations involved and how it's a myth that migration is good for the economy, and that with an aging population, we need more migrants to come in and do the menial work and that kind of thing. I'd always assumed that to be true, and I'd often said things along those lines. But what Elmer does is he says, well, the trouble is, when you think about it, it's really bad, actually, particularly for the working classes, because the more migrants come in, the more healthcare facilities they demand. Housing needs to be built. Infrastructure needs to be expanded. It's not doing economic benefits. It's doing economic harm. And in a way, it's another form of a kind of clandestine form of assault on the population. And then, of course, there's well-known problems with cultural integration, ghettoization, social destabilization in some instances, and none of this is to actually blame the migrants themselves or anything of that nature. Who wouldn't want to come and try and make a better life for themselves? But it's when you see it as part of a bigger picture where this all appears to have been done by design. And again, there is the problem, reaction, solution element to it, because now that we have this problem, what do we do about it? Well, what we really need, Keir Starmer says, digital
The
ID.
digital ID. Yeah.
We need to know who these people are. How do you stop people pouring over the border? The United States-Mexico border. Again, digital ID. And and it's really shocking to see how this works. Serious problems deliberately created for the purpose of introducing ever more authoritarian solutions. Yeah, so that's what I think on migration.
You were very kind and patient to me, but is there anything else that we didn't mention that is very important to perhaps talk about?
Oh, goodness, we've covered so much ground.
Maybe anything that you can prophesy about the next false flag, the next pandemic, anything that you can see coming, the destruction of the monetary system, what people should,
Yeah, I mean,
what do you think is next?
I always say I don't have a crystal ball. So I'm
Yeah.
somewhat averse to making predictions, but the couple of things that I have said are the cyber polygon scenario. Why would they be doing that exercise? There's always exercise and drills involved in these things. They always rehearse them.
Yes.
So cyber polygon, massive internet crisis, and what I've also, and I've written about this as well, is the number of items that get reported about, Facebook or whatever, there was an outage, users couldn't use it for 2 hours on Tuesday. And you often come across these kind of things. Again, I don't think that is accidental. I think there's a deliberate attempt to create the impression subliminally in the public consciousness that the online system isn't secure enough and that it's too vulnerable to cyber hackers, for instance. All of this is being, again, used to seed the idea that we need a more secure system, and therefore an event such as I described earlier, possibly involving a mass internet outage, seems to me to be conceivable. And then the digital ID to be able to get online, maybe they first need to roll the digital ID out before they can do that. Who knows? The other thing that I have mentioned previously is water, based on what Professor Maria Mazzucato, I think she's called, she said quite openly at the World Economic Forum in 2022. Well, climate change isn't really working as a narrative, and we didn't get as many people as we would have liked injected. So maybe we need to think about water. Even a child knows how important water is, and it's just unbelievable to hear how brazen these people speak. When they think that they're safe and secure in their own environment. But that indicates a clear intent at the World Economic Forum to think about the weaponization of water. And I did receive information from one of my subscribers who was connected to some kind of private equity fund or hedge fund or something, that they were starting to position around water and potential water crises. So again, that's pretty disturbing when you hear something like that. That said, that was about 15 months ago, I think, that I was told that, and we haven't had major water shortages across the West yet.
Yes.
But again, it's horrible that we have to be thinking about these things and be on our guard and so on. Of course, if these eventualities do occur, then hopefully people will be able to see through them quicker than before. But the real question is, how much longer is society willing to put up with this kind of thing? These constant manipulations, constant deceptions, constant attacks. This is no way to live, and it's not how a free society lives. It's how a society lives which is dominated and controlled by some very sick and sadistic individuals, typically who operate behind the scenes, hiding their faces, coming up with ways of orchestrating deceptive attacks on the population. This needs to end. These people need to be rooted out and they need to be stopped.
I wish for that, and I hope so. I'm just worried that the philosophy itself changed from freedom to security, and that's why people just, they don't act as a moral agent anymore in their life. They just outsource everything to the same criminals you described so well. Kindly tell me how people can find your work and support you.
Wow, that's a very interesting question now. I used to just say go to dhughes.substack.com, but I don't anymore because there are problems with Substack It has bowed the knee to these online safety acts and has become a censorship platform. Therefore, I have developed my own website now, davidahughes.net. Please head over there if you want to support me. You can sign up for free or paid subscription at my website. All of my content is up there. All of it is available for free. So if you don't have any money, at least make use of the content and help to share it and discuss it with others if you can. As I say, I'm still in the process of trying to improve the functionality on the site. There's various features that I need to add. Migrating subscribers is a massive task. It's taken me a lot of work. As I say, all paid subscribers have at the very least a complimentary subscription to the website. So they're still getting something in that respect for their money. About a quarter of them have been properly migrated over at the moment. That's everyone who pays in British pounds, but I'm just about to start work on the other currencies. I do beg for patience on this. It's a huge job, and I'm not a tech person, and it's been a very steep learning curve for me. But I am moving as fast as I can, and I am doing it with honest intentions, because, as I say, I'm not willing to play games with Substack anymore. I'll keep Substack open for the near future, at least, so that people can still find me there. But it will be no great surprise if I terminate that Substack account at some point this year. But davidahughes.net is now the place to go.
You wrote for the Solari 120 pages document. Is that already available for the public?
Everything is on there for free now. Yeah, there was a 12-month embargo by Solari originally for copyright reasons. That expires this month, so it's now available for free along with everything else.
Fantastic. I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your work. I think you are one of the best, researchers that we have. Your ability to articulate those ideas is beyond belief.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
It's very kind of you to say. No, I really appreciate the invitation. It's not every day I get to address an Israeli audience, and I also like these kind of longer form discussions. I know certain listeners do as well. Short form has its place, but every now and again it's good to do one of these kind of in-depth discussions. So thank you for having me on. Thank you for your time, and all the best.
Thank you very much. All the best.